is going to introduce our next speaker.
Billy Abraham is the Albert Cook Outler Professor of Wesley Studies at Southern Methodist University. He's currently a Frederick J. Crossan Fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame. To show that Billy is greatly appreciated and loved by us here at Asbury, he was awarded the Doctor of Divinity degree by Asbury Theological Seminary in 2008. He received his doctorate degree at Oxford University in 1977 and his Master of Divinity from Asbury Theological Seminary in 1973. We consider Billy one of our illustrious alumni. His teaching specialties are religious epistemology, John Wesley, doctrine of revelation, systematic theology, philosophy of religion, and evangelism, and anything else you can think of. In all of these areas, he has authored many articles and books. One of his latest books is Crossing the Threshold of Divine Revelation, published in 2007 by Erdman. He's widely known for his book, Canon and Criterion in Christian Theology, in which he seeks to renew theology by calling the church back to the canonical sources as represented in the period of our early church fathers. He's an Irish Methodist. If you don't know Billy, you'll know that immediately when he begins to talk. He's also an ordained elder in the Southwest Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church. He's received numerous academic awards and honors, including receiving the Joint Book of the Year Award from the Institute of Christian Studies for his Canon and Criterion in Christian Theology. If Albert Outler was a pioneer as a Wesleyan ecumenical theologian, Abraham appropriately occupies the Albert Outler Chair of Wesley Studies because no Wesleyan theologian today is more involved in promoting what Wesley called the Catholic spirit than Abraham, with his broadly based ecumenical scholarship. Abraham has described himself in this way: I am an unapologetic, dyed-in-the-wool, small L liberal, committed to the fostering of intellectual virtue and the inhibiting of intellectual vice. I have never been a big L liberal, and I have never felt guilty that I have not been one. Indeed, much of what I do and write involves the deconstruction of big L liberal Protestantism. While liberal Protestants did much to help the church come to terms with some critical intellectual changes facing us in the last 2 centuries, they also gave away vital doctrine and spiritual treasures that have to be retrieved today. So Abraham was caught saying that at one occasion. If Abraham has been engaged in the deconstruction of liberal Protestantism, he likewise has been involved in constructive criticism both of fundamentalism and evangelicalism in the interest of restoring the substance of Trinitarian theology and restoring the spirit of critical intellectual inquiry typical of the early church fathers. With his comprehensive grasp of the intellectual issues of our times, we can look forward to his rich insights on his address today, entitled Theology, Neuroscience, and the Soul.
Well, after an introduction like that, I'm just a bog Irishman who, for my sins, is living in Texas. And for the reward of my sanctification, I'm up in Notre Dame for the year. The debate about the relationship between science and theology has taken a whole new turn in the last 10 years or so. One way to tell the story is to say that we've entered a third phase in the discussion. The first phase, was the discussion on the interaction between theology and cosmology, or theology and geology, that we heard about today this morning. Traditional readings of Genesis, developed by the learned Archbishop Usher of Dublin, posited that the world began in 4004 BC. Now, this was clearly incompatible with the proposal that the Earth is roughly 14 billion years old. Now, you'll be glad to know that in order to repair for the sins of Archbishop Usher, it was the Irish who brought Methodism to America. It was not the English. It was the Irish that brought it over here. The English came over later and wrecked it. That issue had to be thought through, and it was. The second phase was the discussion posed by the challenge of evolution within biology, generated in the late 19th century. We've heard a lot about that today. Now, the debate on this lingers on like a bad dose of the flu, but as far as mainstream Christianity is concerned, I think the issue is pretty much settled. Some version of theistic evolution is the favored option. The main alternative to this, that is the young earth option and the intelligent design option, I would say are not really taken seriously within mainstream Christianity. Indeed, they tend to be treated with disdain and contempt. And I think the great danger in the mainstream tradition is a kind of lazy complacency about the issues. In fact, I would draw attention to the forthcoming work of Sarah Coakley, who used to be at Harvard, is now over at Cambridge. She's doing some very interesting new work on the relationship between claims about evolution and claims about creation that I think push the issue forward from within the mainstream tradition. So that discussion is not over completely. Now, before I identify a third phase in the discussion, it's good to pause and get a feel for what kind of issues sit below the surface of these old and somewhat hoary debates. What is it that generates and sustains the ongoing discussion? In the North American scene, one cannot discount the background music of how best to manage the relationship between faith and politics. The science-religion debate intersects with the debate about the secularization of politics, with the ongoing dynamic negotiation of the separation in the United States between the church and state. Yet another factor in the neighborhood of secularization is more broadly cultural. That is, the debate on theology and science touches on the quest in the West for a viable or comprehensive worldview beyond Christianity. The collapse of Christendom, in the case of the United States, the second disestablishment of mainstream Protestantism, has left a void in which many look to science as the best way or the best bet on developing an intellectually satisfying vision of ourselves and the universe. Intelligent layfolk in the churches I know best often take this option unwittingly. Basically, they believe that science tells you the truth about the universe par excellence. Thus, to turn to science as the final revelation of the truth about ourselves, this is most visible, of course, in the new atheism, but this has traction precisely because it is now assumed that theology is epistemologically absolutely empty. We are at the bottom end of the food chain. Theology, it is generally believed, even in many of the private universities that were established with a theological base, deserves its lowly status at the margins of the academy or locked away in a private world that has no cognitive status in the real world of truth and knowledge. So I think we need to pay attention to the massive intellectual shift that's been going on in the Western culture. Nor can one ignore the role of the media seeking out the kind of emotive, if not sensational, issues that will whip up interest in the general public. There's a lively and polemical edge in the media that readily pounces on the conflict and warfare metaphors. So, if you like, there's an inescapable public dimension that is absent in Europe. In Europe, I would say the temperature of the debate and the noise level are much lower than they are in the United States. I suppose the United States is probably the only country in the world where you can write a book on how you lost your faith and make $1 million. It's an amazing phenomenon. I mean, conversion narratives sort of in reverse, especially by biblical scholars who went to Wheaton and then took off and went to Princeton and lost their faith because of higher criticism or something like that. It's just absolutely astonishing. I wish I could make $1 million out of telling my conversion narrative from atheism to theism. Wouldn't that be great? Anyway, that's the way things are. Now, these issues, these observations only scratch the surface, of course. We need to get a sense as to why theology and science intrinsically interact, as to why this debate is not a mere epiphenomenon generated by those other realities I've just mentioned. The debate arises because both theology and science make robust claims about the world. Now, the good bishop touched on this last night, and I think he's right on the money. Theology and science are not isolated disciplines with a neat dividing wall of separation. Consider theology as this. It is that discipline committed to studious reflection on God and on all else insofar as it relates to God. Now, some of you put your floppy disk in and you know where that comes from. It's from Aquinas. Theology is critical reflection, serious reflection on God and everything else insofar as it relates to God. So there's no square inch of the universe that's, so to speak, off limits. Science, in turn, is one of our best ways, surely one of our best ways, of gaining information about the natural order. Now, I don't see this as in any way totalitarian. I would be bored if science didn't sort of make these big claims and theology didn't make these big claims. I mean, we might as well go off and sell insurance or something, do something easy, fight terrorism or something, you know. I mean, the beauty of this is it's so big and so demanding. Hence, the potential for conflict is intrinsically in play. Serious theologians are bound to make claims, say, about the created order, and within that, about human beings. And these are precisely now the objects of scientific investigation. So it's obvious that the potential for competing descriptions and explanations exists right from the get-go. Now, this was patently clear in the first two phases of the discussion. As I've said, theologians claimed that the world was created in 4004 BC. That turned out to be false. Hence, few people had a nervous breakdown but got over it. Theologians claimed that God created Adam and Eve, the first human agents, directly from the dust of the earth. Evolutionary theory challenged this by positing that human agents arose indirectly through a combination of natural selection, random variation, and the survival of the fittest, or whatever other list you want to put in there. And in fact, that list needs to be looked at very carefully and maybe even revised. Beyond that, the theory of evolution challenged conventional ways of understanding the meaning and origins of the Bible. Thus, it raised questions about how to distinguish the literal from the figurative, and it also raised questions about how to understand divine inspiration of Scripture, and it cut into claims about the uniqueness of human beings in the wider scheme of creation. And it wreaked havoc on the kind of appeal to divine design that had become conventional in Victorian England. So, I mean, if that doesn't give you a nightmare, you know, I don't know what will. I mean, the late 19th century, it was a rough time, I'll tell you. And the issues were coming in thick and fast from every direction. And not least because, in fact, here you get a set of claims made about human beings by theologians, and that conflicts with empirical claims that are being made, in this case, by scientists. Now, the same logic of interaction is in play in the third phase of the debate on what I'm calling here the interaction between neuroscience and theology. It would be fair to say, I think, that neuroscience is now sweeping through the academy like a hurricane. I watched a very interesting video from Duke this last week by a philosopher dealing with the place of neuroscience in the law. That's fascinating. It'll show up, no doubt, in other areas as well. Now, my interest here is in the impact of neuroscience on theology. And my aims are modest, as they should be at this stage of the discussion, although by the time I'm finished, some of you may think it's rather rash, and that I'm full of intellectual vice, which would be very bad in the light of what has just been said earlier. I want to do four things in what follows. First, in line with my opening comments, I want to identify where science and neuroscience and theology actually overlap. Because initially it looks as if they don't overlap at all. So we need to pause and get our bearings with some care. Secondly, I want to summarize the most radical version of the appeal to neuroscience, which is developed intentionally as a challenge to theology. That's certainly out there. Third, I want to look at a very important theological response to that challenge that has surfaced in and around the work of Professor Nancy Murphy at Fuller Theological Seminary. In fact, in many ways, I think that agenda at Fuller is the only agenda that's in play at the moment as a serious discussion on the relationship between neuroscience and theology. And then, being the contrarian that I am, I want to sketch the contours of an alternative research agenda, and en route I shall seek to provide some intellectual motivation for this alternative research agenda. Now, our first assignment is to get clear on how theology and neuroscience interact. That is, what claims do theologians make that overlap with the kind of claims that crop up in neuroscience? Now, initially, this question does not look very promising. Take a hike, and it's just one of those sort of idle questions that we ask. Neuroscience focuses on the nature of the brain. Do theologians, do we really want to say anything about the brain? Surely we are no more interested in the brain than we are, say, in elephants' testicles. You say, well, where did that come from? In fact, Aquinas has a very interesting discussion in his commentary on Job on the issue of what's said in Scripture about elephant testicles and what's said outside of Scripture on elephant testicles. You've got to watch out. You never know when a theologian is going to pop up and say interesting things. So what subsection, to come back here, what subsection of theological studies or systematic theology does this topic fall into? What does Scripture or the great theologians of the tradition have to say about the brain? And the answer, of course, is nothing. Well, not so fast. Once we turn from the abstract idea of neuroscience to what neuroscientists and some of their philosophical friends say, then the picture changes dramatically. What is at issue is a theological vision of human nature. Neuroscience overlaps with theology because neuroscience develop comprehensive visions of human nature. And human nature is most certainly on the theological radar screen. Yet we need surely to be a lot more precise. Theologians, as I see it, develop two different networks of claims about human nature. The first involves various doctrines of sin. In the church I go to, they're afraid to mention the word sin, but I think it's a great word. You come from Ireland, you have no problems believing in sin. You see so much of it around you. Now, think for this moment. Think about the doctrine of sin. Think of the proposals of Augustine, of Pelagius, that much despised Irish theologian from Bangor in County Down, or think of Wesley, or Reinhold Niebuhr, or Judith Plasko, just to take a few. In this instance, what's on offer is a vision of the human predicament nested in a wider analysis of creation, freedom, fall, and redemption. Now, if you don't catch the Wesleyan ring of that, I hope, well, let me tell you it's there. Most people just go from creation to fall to redemption. With Wesley, you can't do that. You've got to have a narrative of freedom at the very core of creation. It's very, very interesting. Now, the focus of these claims is simply soteriological. What's gone wrong with the world? How do you fix it? Why do you have to lock your doors at night? Who's going to save us? The focus of the second kind of claim, however, is broadly what I'm going to call metaphysical. That is, it involves a vision of the human person or the human agent as an ultimate factor or feature of the universe as a whole. I'm sorry I seem to be so sort of deliberate here. I loved the last talk. In fact, I loved all the talks. But I was listening very carefully as to when talk about human agency in persons would either come up or not come up. I'll not say what I found. It was just fascinating how quickly the language of agency and personhood simply gets substituted by the language of the brain. The brain does thus and so. That's a very interesting shift philosophically. Now here, think of the claim, again, as we've heard, that human beings are made in the image of God and are best thought of as embodied souls, or, what's often put quite differently, a combination of minds and bodies, or as bodies with a special kind of Aristotelian form. Okay? Now, one way to make the point would be to say that over and against natural agents, human beings are irreducibly personal agents, endowed with a lot of things, but endowed with the ability, the genuine, real ability to make choices and decisions. Now, once one puts the issue in this latter fashion, it becomes clear immediately that we can logically distinguish between these two kinds of claims. That is, they cannot ontologically be separated. This is very tricky stuff. The soteriological and broadly the metaphysical at times can bleed into each other. Thus, doctrines of sin lead into doctrines of liberty on the one hand, or of determinism that are highly ramified and contested. Christian theologians in the West have in fact been very, very leery indeed of doctrines of freedom. Think of Luther's polemic against Erasmus, or think of the soft determinism of Calvin and Edwards, or think of the current work of Eleanor Stump in the deployment of the recent insights of Harry Frankfurt about the distinction between first-order and second-order volitions. Frankfurt is a determinist. Stump rejects determinism. But you can see the issue of determinism is entangled on the whole issue of what it is, in fact, to make choices, and in the case of Christians, to say that we sin. So the debate on the relationship between sin and determinism from the theological side has, in fact, been driven by an effort, as you know, to safeguard the doctrine of grace. Theologians have been more than ready to surrender doctrines of human liberty and freedom to do so. And it's a matter of intense debate as to how we're to reconcile freedom and grace. So while we can rightly distinguish the soteriological from the metaphysical, once you begin to look at the fine print, you very quickly find yourself with doctrines of human agents that are fully determined, that cannot but sin, which have to be rescued by grace. Off you are to doctrines of double unconditional predestination, and off into la la land you go. Wow, we thought it was easy. Now, to come back to the intersection between theology and neuroscience, the debate to date has centered on how to bring into harmony some elements of what I'm calling the metaphysical dimensions or focus of Christian claims about human nature with the robust claims of many neuroscientists. Notice I don't say neuroscience, scientists. The sticking point is obvious. Many theologians have been committed to a dualist vision of human beings, and neuroscience, prima facie, is a committed foe of any and all forms of dualism as applied to human agents. By the way, the test case for this is what you're going to do in your eschatology. And what you think of what happens when you die, whether there's an intermediate state, and what form that takes. By the way, Wesley thought in the intermediate state, he was such a workaholic, he thought that you got to help out on either side. If you went the wrong way, you got to help out the devils and all his minions, and you went the other side, you got to help with the angels. But if you take the view, for example, which Luther did, that it's all over when you die, and then this long sleep until you're resurrected at the end, that'll really show your underwear when it comes to your conception of the human agent. Whether you think, in fact, there's more to human agents than simply the matter of being a body or complex configuration and organizations of a body. Now, we can see this most clearly, what I'm after here, if we look at the most radical version of the appeal to neuroscience. One point of entry into this research is to ask yourself this question. What would you have if you had a grand theory of everything? This is what, and against the metaphysician is after. I want a full-blown, no-holds-barred, industrial-strength theory of, you've got to cover everything. A grand theory of everything would be a theory that basically accounts for everything. It would have breadth and length. It would have explanatory power all the way to the bottom and all the way to the top. It would leave nothing out. It would be intellectually robust. And it would be emotionally powerful. Now, over the last 300 years or so, one such grand theory of everything has emerged, I think, now within Western culture. And it has four crucial components. As I identify these, you will see that these components what we're looking for is what I would call the crown jewels of the life of the mind. First component, ultimate reality is essentially matter from top to bottom. Everything that exists is ultimately reducible to physics and chemistry. You and I are complex units of particles and impersonal forces. And that includes all of us, you and me, and the person sitting next to you. That's what I'm going to call the ontological component. It can also be identified, this first one, as a reductionist component, where human agents are reduced not just for methodological purposes of more elegant research, but in the stronger and more interesting sense that they are best understood and explained as fundamentally made up of or constituted by matter. So the ontological heavy lifting is done at the level of physical reality. So whatever we find to be the case at the level of physical reality, that's it. That's the ultimate constituents of the universe. Now, second, there is what I'm going to call a deterministic component. Reality is essentially governed by physical laws from one end to the other. There are no uncaused events in the world. Inside the world system, everything arises out of the preceding physical conditions. There is no free will in any robust libertarian sense. Of course, things are more complex at the subatomic level, but even there we can hear the echo of Einstein. God does not throw dice. The determinism is statistical, it's not absolute, but it's real. Thirdly, there's what's crucial here, what we might call a causal closure component. I'm being a little bit technical. It simply means this. There are no causes outside the physical system as a whole. And what that means is that there is not really any human agency. There may be consciousness. The grand theory wobbles about that. But basically, that's best seen possibly as an epiphenomenon. It's like the steam coming off the sausages on the grill. It's caused by what's happening beneath and below it. There are no genuine causes other than those countenanced by the physical senses. And this is the causal closure component. And then finally, fourth, there is what I call the rationality component. This grand theory has been established by science. It's not a matter of dogma or human tradition or authority or not least at all, divine revelation. It is serious science, pure and simple. And the relevant science now, doing the heavy lifting on this grand theory, is neuroscience. If you're a rational person, you will sign on with enthusiasm, and the payoff is that you will be emotionally satisfied at an intellectual level. And that's the rationality component. Now, what this summary makes clear is that there's much more to the intersection of theology and neuroscience than the findings of neuroscience. We have, in fact, a combination of scientific and philosophical theory. You can either say we've got lots of fine insights here, or we've got misperception. And it is the combination of these claims that leads to the intersection with theological claims about human nature. So it should not surprise us in the least that theologians who reject the radical version of the appeal to neuroscience do so by very carefully sorting out the entangled components and proposing a very different way to absorb the findings of neuroscience. Now, one web of intersecting claims replaces another web, if you like, of intersecting claims. So what you've got here, you've got a kind of combination of philosophical reflection, theory, and scientific data, and you can sort of, if we change the material on the philosophical side, then that allows us to still appeal to the neuroscience, but we put the two back together again and have an integrated account of the relationship between philosophy and neuroscience. Now, one theologian who deserves special attention in this regard is Professor Nancy Murphy. Trained to the doctoral level in both philosophy of science and theology, she is well placed to make her mark on the discussion. In addition, her formation in both Catholicism and more recently in the Anabaptist tradition ensures additional layers of richness in her formation as a theologian. That's a pretty good deal to be brought up Catholic and then topped off and improved on by the Anabaptists. Over the years, she has teamed up with a network of theologians, philosophers, and biblical scholars. I'm sure we all know the work of Joel Green in relationship to this, to spearhead a comprehensive response to the challenge posed by developments in neuroscience. I think this work deserves much more extended articulation and attention than I can give it here, but I want to lay out the core of her proposals, and I'll summarize it by moving through a series of just simple propositions. First, says Murphy and her colleagues, the findings of neuroscience make it clear that human agents are initially best seen as physical organisms. Dualism, therefore, is false. The view that human beings are combinations of minds and bodies is rejected. And so too is any belief in human beings as involving a trichotomy of spirit and mind and body. If you look at the fathers, that's what they argue over. Will we go with a twofold division or will we go with a threefold division? Now, I, in fact, think you need a lot more descriptive material to do justice to the complexity of human beings, but that's neither here nor there. The key move that's made first by Murphy, I think would be fair to say, is that human beings are physical organisms through and through, and there is no other substance above and beyond the physical organism. Second, theologians can readily dispose of dualism in their vision of human nature because it's a late development in the tradition. It's not in keeping with the biblical materials on human nature, but was really imported into the tradition in the interaction of early post-biblical theology with the interaction with Platonic philosophy. So it's really, she leans heavily here on the crucially important Hellenization thesis that was developed in the early part of the 20th century by Harnack, that what you had pure, wonderful forms of Christianity. It took off into the Greco-Roman world, and then it got corrupted by Platonic philosophy, and that's when you get all this dualist stuff coming in. Moreover, talk about human nature being constituted by souls and bodies was originally an unstable doctrine that got flattened into the standard version of Cartesian dualism that flourished in the tradition in the modern period. I think actually it's a very, very interesting and important point in the history of ideas. Old Descartes, I sometimes say that the Anabaptists are going to have to stand in line to apologize to Constantine, and I think all modern theologians are going to have to stand in line to apologize to Descartes if they make it to the other side. I hope some of them don't make it to the other side, but that's just an Irish comment. But she's onto something really important here, that in the process of interaction with the philosophy of the Enlightenment, a very crucial ingredients in our vision of human beings. For example, the human beings have a conscience. It's a very, very interesting and important claim. Or that human beings have a heart. It's not just that they have a soul, that they are a soul. It's a very rich description, and I think she's absolutely right here that what's happened in the modern period is the reduction in the wake of Descartes has not been a healthy thing. Hence, she says, an inference from this is that Christian theology can dispense with dualism, whether Platonic or Cartesian, without shedding any theological tears. Third, what motivates the adoption of physicalism, her version of physicalism, and the rejection of dualism is a sincere desire to rid the Christian tradition of alien materials that are a hindrance to contemporary educated people from coming to faith. Now here what you can see is a very important apologetic and evangelistic interest. I mean, if Christianity is going to be an offense, let it be a real offense about the cross or something substantial. Let it not be an offense about some Cartesian dualism. Clear the decks of all that stuff so that, in fact, people can come to Jesus and get saved. So there's a very important evangelistic and apologetic, so to speak, it seems to be, dimension to this work. And then fourth, this commitment to physicalism should not be confused with reductionism. This is where it gets tricky. What is proposed is a vision of what's called non-reductive physicalism. Now, physicalism is the view that the ultimate reality of human beings is essentially physical. We're essentially physical organisms. But the problem, of course, you got there then is that all we are? How do we account for the other rich descriptions that we want to give either just as human beings or as theologians about human beings? Now, reductive physicalism is disastrous both for Christian theology and for the rationality of human thinking. But non-reductive physicalism is not. Now, what's on display in non-reductive physicalism is a vision of reality in which matter is organized into more complex configurations so that there emerges new forms or new structures with their own integrity and reality. So absolutely crucial here is that you have a doctrine of emergence, that when organisms become more complex, there's new structures come into play. As you move up the hierarchy of being, my language for the moment, you also encounter new causal factors that emerge at each new level. Now, while there is a clear commitment here to emergence, we emphatically do not have the emergence. This is the crucial claim. We do not have the emergence of some new stuff, like a mind or soul. Rather, we have emergence to new levels of structure and organization. The crucial images become spatial images of levels. I think Spinoza will be very happy with a lot of this stuff, actually, but we'll not go there. New configurations of structure constitute new causal factors so that you have both upward causation in the creation of new structures and whatnot, and then downward causation back into the world out of which these new structures emerge. Life itself, in new configuration of emergent complexity, produces new sorts of causal interactions. When you have more complex structures, it's not that they're new causal forces, psychic factors or vital forces or minds or souls. Rather, the causal forces of physics will enter into vastly more complex interactions. The laws of the laws of physics do not predict the new configurations and interactions, but whatever emerges does not violate the laws of physics. And then fifth and finally, all this is entirely compatible with what theologians want to say about human agents and their place in creation. This is Murphy's claim. Thus, theologians can still, with integrity, be committed to bodily resurrection in eschatology, rather than the Greek notion of the immortality of the soul. They can be more biblical in their thinking about human agents. They can avoid interventionist conceptions of divine agency in the doctrine of creation. And they can sustain all of the traditional features of human agents as being unique in creation as a whole. Thus, human agents have the capacity to operate on the basis of moral reasoning. They can act on the basis of goals and principles. They are free, but interestingly, not causally undetermined. They have consciousness. They can relate to God and engage in worship. And they can see the world as open to divine action at its most basic level. That is, in fact, at the quantum level. Now, that's a heavy piece of stuff that I've just dumped on you. You still with me? It's amazing you're still here at this time of the day. It's wonderful. Now, I've chosen to review the work of Nancy Murphy because it's by far, I think, the most sophisticated and interesting effort on the part of theologians to deal with the developments in neuroscience. And maybe I'm wrong about this, and if I'm wrong, just help me. There's a pleasing boldness in her work that is both specific in the claims advanced, and there's a readiness to take the discussion all the way to the bottom. I love people like that. Don't muck about. Stop sitting on the fence. Let's just go for broke on these claims. Thus, she has developed a full-scale epistemology of theology. She did marvelous work with Feyerabend that replicates her work in the epistemology of science. So she's worked out a full-scale account of what it is to know in science, what it is to know in theology, how these, in fact, converge in various ways. And all of this, in turn, is deployed to deal with the recent journeys into postmodernity, familiar to virtually all students of theology. And she's also keen to pursue the ethical and spiritual dimensions of the turn to neuroscience. This is an industrial strength theologian. What we actually have here, in fact, is a comprehensive research program that involves interdisciplinary work in biblical studies, the history of science, the history of doctrine, neuroscience, philosophy, and theology. Now, this interdisciplinary sort of dimension is the most difficult, I think, the most difficult dimension to operationalize when it comes to actually pursuing these issues in the future. And you're going to see this when I get to an alternative agenda. This means that, as far as this afternoon is concerned, it would be utterly futile as well as unproductive to offer any kind of quick or decisive refutation of her claims. Research programs do not work that way. Indeed, it is imperative, in my judgment, that such research programs be envisaged and pursued with aggressive tenacity and persistence. So 3 cheers for Murphy. Templeton, give her more money and keep the show on the road until we figure out if she's got it right. I would even say the same, by the way, to the materialist research programs that I outlined earlier. I think those need to be given a full run for their money. No half-baked atheism here. You know, take it all the way to the bottom. Fund it. Let's see where this is going to take us. I think, in fact, that research programs like this are the lifeblood of the academy and of the journey to discovery. Now, it may be unfortunate that the price we pay for these programs is that they appear dogmatic. No, they really are dogmatic. They are initially unfalsifiable. You simply follow Quine and make the necessary adjustments in the wider web of belief. They are emotionally charged. They are often impervious to evidence. They are intellectually self-serving. And to use a phrase of my favorite 19th century theologian, John Henry Newman, they are often quite bigoted. That's to say, they have one big idea and they bring it in and shove it at you no matter what the topic is. In this respect, there is a point here. Science turns out to be like theology across the centuries. Talk about getting sort of uptight about the issues. Happily, given secularization, the state stops us from killing each other across the board in the academy. Be part of any serious faculty, and you'll know what I mean. But there are other ways by means of which to ward off attacks from opponents in competing research programs. You demonize them, you deny them tenure, you get control of editorial boards, you exclude them from doctoral programs, you spread disinformation, you cut off information, and so on and so forth. Friends, it's a Hobbesian world. We don't have to be Hobbesian, but it's a Hobbesian world. And it's a Hobbesian world in the academy. Which brings me to my constructive proposals. I think we need a radically different research agenda. Now, the initial motivation for this are these considerations. First, both of these proposals are at the end of the day committed to a vision of full-scale determinism. And I think neither, therefore, can support the kind of robust vision of human freedom and agency that I think is vital for morality, for theology, and for our medical and for our political practices. Now, you could write a whole paper on that there. Now, by the way, I think the whole issue of free will is a really tricky one, and you've got to take into account the whole debate about sin if you're going to take that seriously, but that's another topic. So I think here I'm waving the Wesleyan flag on his thoughts on necessity, that it really does matter. The issue of freedom really does matter, and I'm not at all convinced that there's a sufficiently robust conception of freedom at the heart of either of these programs. Second, I remain unpersuaded that the forms of reductionism involved are not ultimately a form of elimination that fails to deal with irreducible features of our human and cultural landscape. Now, that, again, would require a longish paper to defend. Thirdly, neither of these programs is compatible with the fullness and robustness of what I want to call the canonical faith of the Church, which has its own reliable warrants, and which therefore, from the theological side of the aisle, deserves a full run for its money. Now, you want to know more about that? That's part of what's at stake in Canon and Criterion, and in a later book called Canonical Theism. All we need here, however, to pursue an alternative research agenda is not some apodictic disproof of the current options. It's enough that within this highly contested arena, we satisfy two conditions. First, there is enough skepticism and informed counterintuition to these proposals to be worried about the foundations of the research programs available. And second, I think the other desiderata is that we begin to lay out the contours of an alternative research agenda. I've already indicated that the first condition, as far as I'm concerned, is satisfied. I'm utterly skeptical that they're going to solve the crucial problems involved, but it remains to provide a brief sketch of an alternative research agenda, and to that I now turn. Now, in what follows, I'm as much expressing an aggressive aspiration more than predicting whether this agenda will finally get off the ground. And like everything else, it'll depend upon funding. And I think the really crucial problem we face in the academy on this question is that, we all work in our own silos. And then maybe from time to time, two silos get interconnected. But there's a lot of other issues that are interconnected here that I think need to be brought into play, and you'll see why I think this is therefore a precarious option. But I think on the end it's a very important option. Now, the envisioned project agenda began for me one Saturday morning in La Madeleine coffee shop, 2 minutes from SMU, right beside the football stadium there, where, by the way, we've won a few games. In the line, I met a graduate student in computer science from Stanford who had his own high-tech startup company. Now, you have to believe that wonderful things can happen when an Irish theologian meets an American computer science in a French restaurant in Texas. Now, what are the chances of that being determined by the preceding physical conditions? Now, when we got to talking, I discovered that he too was a skeptic about the grand theory of everything that I sketched and about the Christian materialism in vogue in post-conservative, progressive evangelical circles. So we started networking, and over time we put together a research team that met about 3 years ago in Princeton Village, and which we hope to put back together and go to work. Now, what would this research involve? It begins with a series of ingenious experiments in neuroscience that show, I put it in square quotes, show that you can change your brain states by mental action. Now, the crucial researcher here is Professor Jeffrey Schwartz, who is research professor in psychiatry at UCLA. He has a very interesting early book called Brain Lock, and he has a new book which is coming out in June, which is called, aggressively, You Are Not Your Brain. A very, very in-your-face sort of title. Now, Schwartz, by the way, was the one who discovered the part of the brain that was connected to OCD. He worked with Francis Crick. And a very, very interesting psychiatrist and researcher. He has put together a small team from Canada and China, including, by the way, Mario Beauregard, who showed up in the last talk. If you want to read one book related to this project, his book that's in your bibliography, which is wonderful, that's a very, very interesting book. Beauregard is one of the top neuroscientists in Montreal. And we've added in, just for good luck, some folk from China. Now, here's the crucial issue. We can actually measure, this is the claim, the two crucial factors in play. On the one hand, we can measure the density of focused attention, and on the other hand, we can measure the changes in the brain. So this is not just sort of taking scans of the state of the brain. You actually can work on focused human attention and see what difference, if any, it makes in the developments in the brain. Now, the first part of that has been developed, trying to figure out how to handle the focused human attention by elegant psychological work devised by Kirkware and Brown of Virginia Commonwealth University. And of course, the second has to do with the function magnetic resonance imagery. Now, what I would love to see happen is that we would gather together the work already done. This would be the bottom-up end part, and then commission a new set of experiments that would test this claim rigorously. And at this stage, I'm going to bet a good bottle of Australian wine, if you'll allow me to do that at Asbury, that the findings will be confirmed. The mind really does change the brain. Now, if this is the case, it is a dramatic discovery. Now, notice that we're not here cooking the results in neuroscience. We're starting from the state-of-the-art work in neuroscience with professional scientists, following the rigorous protocols and whose competence is unquestioned at this point. Now, I can hear you saying, but correlation does not mean causation. True indeed. But we're not speaking simply of correlation and event causation. We are already in the world of what philosophers called agent causation. We're not talking of one event simply being followed by another. We're speaking of human action, specific, identifiable human action, making a difference in brain states. That's what's at stake here. That's a crucial causal claim. So at that stage, what do you need? You've got to have serious philosophical work on agency. I mean, that's a massive industry in its own right. And in fact, we have got on board precisely the folk who work on that topic. But I have further news for you. We can tackle the worry about causation from the side of science as well from another angle. Dig down deeper into the brain to the subatomic level, and of course you'll find yourself in the field of quantum physics. And what do we find there? We find that the revolution from classical physics to quantum physics reflects a world that, at least on one understanding, is open to human agency. Our observations actually change and stabilize the happenings at the subatomic level. Now, technically, what's involved here, of course, is the collapse of the wave function. So we need somebody to help us on that score, at least one to help us on that score. And we have as a member of our team Henry Stapp from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He, in fact, is one of the truly great world-class physicists who worked in his early career with von Neumann, with Heisenberg, with Pauli, and with other revolutionaries of quantum physics, and has spent years and years and years trying to figure out what to make about all of that. Now, the issue we are pursuing this is a very simple one. Here is a simple one as I see it. Could it be that the results of the work in neuroscience are best explained by saying that the changes in the brain involve the stabilization of the wave function at the subatomic level? Now, listen, I'm a bog Irishman, and I'm way out swimming in waters that are way beyond me. But there are other people who are working on this stuff and connecting up what's going on in neuroscience with what's happening in quantum physics. That's what's at stake here. And this is the issue why living in our own silos is such a problem, and finding enough funding to put all of these people together and bring them into conversation is so imperative. Now, I can hear you say, but isn't Henry Stapp's vision a contested interpretation of quantum physics? Yes, indeed. There are at least 8 interpretations of the collapse of the wave function, and 4 of them will allow for a role of the human observer, and 4 don't. However, it is a thoroughly plausible interpretation. It is a live option. And to tackle the tangled issues here, what we need is not just physicists, and we'll have physicists, but we also need first-rate work in philosophy of physics. And for that, in fact, we hope to have the work of Professor Hans Halvorsen of Princeton to help us sort out that stuff. He's one of the absolutely top-notch younger philosophers of science that's out there. And by the way, went to Calvin College. So any of you who went to Calvin, 3 cheers for Calvin. So the claim here is that we can change brain states by human agency has got legs, and it's got scientific legs. Now, does this make a difference? Does belief in human agency matter? Well, to answer that, we stay at the level of science. This time, the science of psychology. At this point, we would love to commission a set of ingenious experiments that explores this issue, to be done by Professor Jonathan Schuller from Santa Barbara. Now, he's got, I don't know what these psychologists, you folk are really something, what you can dream up in terms of the experiments you do. I'm looking at our colleague over here from this wonderful earlier talk. Suppose you tell one group of students that they are determined and that they have no agency. And suppose you tell another group of students that they have agency and that they're genuinely free. What do you find? The first group is more likely to cheat than the second. So these proposals, if you put them at that level, really do matter. You bet it matters. Common sense and common law are dead right about their fundamental intuitions on the importance of free will, if you like, and human agency. In fact, in a recent review of the literature at a conference in Davos in Switzerland that I was at, I heard one professor, Professor Niki Toma, insist that in fact materialistic and deterministic visions of human agents positively harm people. That's a very interesting psychological claim. And this was, if you like, from a sociologist in Cyprus. Now you can see now that we're moving from human agency down to the subatomic level. We then move back up to the psychological level, but we do not stop there. I want to take it right up from there to as high as we can go. I want us to press our explorations up into the philosophical, religious, and theological arenas. So, in order to make that possible, we've enlisted a group of philosophers who work on the mind-body problem, on the metaphysics of personhood, on the philosophy of action, and of course, always we've got to have epistemologists somewhere hanging around. At the religious level, which is important, we want to have an expert in Buddhist studies. David Brooks of the New York Times coined the term neural Buddhists to describe those Buddhists who are seeking to integrate the best in contemporary science with Buddhism. In fact, the Buddhists are way ahead of this game in terms of relating to neuroscience. And it's partly because they don't have any doctrine of the self. Very interesting. But one of our own team, in fact, is both a Jesuit priest and a Zen Buddhist master. And that's my colleague, Professor Ruben Abito, who in fact teaches with me at Perkins School of Theology. By the way, he's also married, and I was best man at his wedding. And at the reception afterwards, he got out the guitar and he sang, "I did it my way." Isn't the world amazing? So it's very important that we have people who are working out of a completely different metaphysical standpoint. Now you ask, how do we get from there to theology? Christian theology has long grappled with the idea of human agency. There are libraries of critical reflection on it. Professor David Kelsey of Yale has just brought out a 2-volume work on the topic. As we know, we claim human agents are made in the image of God. So there's an immediate connection to divine agency. And there's a wealth of material on divine agency and divine action that's relative. And I've, in fact, spending a lot of my time trying to sort out claims about divine action over the last 60 years. Not my 60 years, I mean the 60 years of research. God creates and sustains all that is. The world is mind-dependent at its deepest levels. You're going to have to say that if you're serious as a theologian. So I personally want to work on sorting out how to develop a vision of divine agency that is compatible with the quiet revolutions happening within earshot of us all, both in neuroscience and quantum physics. But that'll be off to the edge of the other stuff I want to do. Moreover, it has been a long-standing intuition of a host of Christian theologians that the mystery in divine agency and reality is mirrored in an irreducible mystery about human agency and human reality. There's a kind of apophatic strain that runs from the divine to the human that easily gets lost in modern philosophy. So what should we make of all that? Hence, I'm interested in, if you like, with others, in working through those theological, epistemological, and in fact, issues of the philosophy of language is what we have to do at that point. Now, in closing, let me be absolutely clear what would be at stake if we were able to pull this off. We're not here running one more tired debate about the relationship between religion and science. This is not some kind of shotgun wedding between science and religion. This research agenda would be driven by a network of experiments in neuroscience. It insists on a relevant range of academic expertise within and without science. And that's precisely what you would need. You need agnostics, Buddhists, Jews, Christians, the whole 9 yards. Thus, we have deliberately set out to counter the bad side effects of many research agendas in this domain. We refuse to wall ourselves off from genuine diversity in the research trenches. Second, this is not another tired effort to deal with the new atheism. I find it actually interesting and salutary that John Wesley, in his treatment of science in his own day, revised the standard vision of natural philosophy by eliminating the drive to use science to combat atheism. He was content to explore the power, the wisdom, the goodness, and the kindness of God in his survey of the wisdom of God in creation. So I think, while I'm a passionate Irishman and, love a good dogfight as much as anybody else, we need to lower the temperature, get more expertise, and develop intellectual virtue at the table. So this would be a positive research program that seeks to find a natural home for genuine human agency in a scientific vision of the universe. And it rigorously follows out the evidence beyond that beyond there, wherever it leads. Clear-headed, robust, fallible, revisable, and rational. Now, I hear you whisper. You say this is fallible and revisable. So what if all this turns out to be wrong? Well, two quick answers to that question in closing. First, if all this turns out to be wrong, take a break, make a fresh start, or we can throw our intellectual weight behind other research agendas that are out there. That's what all good researchers and academics do. So don't get your underwear in a twist. Go back, take a shower, get dressed up again, and go back to work. The world is a very complex place. But if it all turns out to be wrong, we face a dilemma. On the one hand, if the only thing that exists is matter, then it doesn't matter if our proposals turn out to be wrong. We're just bags of molecules, bundles of sensation, or puppets of deterministic forces. We're complex configurations of physics and chemistry. There are no real agents, decisions, actions, and values. Now, Professor Murphy still thinks that you can help ourselves to these notions after embracing physicalism. I find this utterly unpersuasive. So the results do not matter one way or the other. If we fail for whatever reason, the whole agenda collapses. It'll not matter, for all we are is matter. On the other hand, if we're on the right lines, then it really does matter. We're genuine agents. We ask genuine questions. We can make real decisions. We have value. And we have real freedom and real responsibility. This vision, if we're true, is not make-believe. It fits with the best science that we can muster. And I think, therefore, it should be an essential element in any grand theory of everything. And I would add that for any serious theologian, it's going to be an essential element in any robust theological anthropology of the 20th century. 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Abraham.